Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 2018 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz tournaments. The first 3 days are all rapid. They play 3 rounds of rapid chess. That means you have 25 minutes on your clock. 10 seconds are added for every move that you make. The first 2 days, we did see Fabiano Caruana just dominate. And taking the lead into day 3. Unfortunately, he faltered coming out the gate in round 7. He had the white pieces going against Dominguez and lost. And then he went on to draw the next 2 rounds. That opens up the door for other competitors to actually come in and tie Fabiano for the lead, or actually go in and win the rapid portion themselves. One of those players looking to get a share of the victory in the rapid portion is Nakamura. We saw him lose in round 1. Since then, he has been on a tear. He does face a tough challenger in round 9, and that is Dominguez, the same wildcard player that Fabiano lost to when Fabiano had the white pieces in round 7. So we're going to go ahead and get into it, starting out with Nakamura. The white pieces starts out pawn e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and if you watch any top-level play, you pretty much know that this is going to be the Berlin defense, and that's exactly what we see. Knight to f6, castle on the king side, knight takes on e4, and then rook to e1. There's really 2 options that white normally plays here, pawn to d4 or rook to e1, and Nakamura decides for rook to e1. Now the knight comes back to d6, and then knight up here, e5, attacking the knight. Bishop here, e7. We see the bishop retreat back to f1. After the knight takes, rook captures here. Castle on the king side, and then knight to c3. Just development move from white. And this is where I thought it was interesting as far as how black continues here. We see so much Berlin defense. You really get accustomed to what moves players are going to make. But there's a few situations where you're not really sure how they're going to continue, especially in a rapid portion. These guys are going blazing fast. They're not really thinking more than a second or 2 in their move. So it's all about preparation. That's why you see a lot of Berlin defense. They just prepared this so much. But in this position, where does black go from here? I was expecting bishop to f6, forcing the rook to move. Could always play pawn to b6, opening up for light square bishop, come fianchetto to b7, attack the light squares in the center of the board. But we see something interesting, and that's knight back to e8. Bringing the material back to the 8th ring, not something I expected to see. Knight to d5. Nakamura says, yeah, I'm going to start pushing my material here. Bishop to d6, forcing the knight to come back, or the rook to come back to e1. Pawn to c6, forcing the knight to come back e3. Bishop e7, knight up here, f5, attacking the bishop. Bishop g5, queen to e2, setting up for the knight to come to e7, since both the bishop and the queen are defending this square. Wants to make sure he has extra defenders here. Pawn down here to d5, and then knight to e7 says, yeah, I want to go ahead and take one of your bishops. I want to have the bishop pair in this game. And that's exactly what happens. We see the king come to h8 since it was under check, and then knight takes, and then the rook captures here on c8. Pawn to b3, opening up for the dark square bishop to come to b2, fianchetto on the queen side of the board. Knight to f6, just development move, getting this knight involved. It wasn't doing much back here on the 8th rank, so wants to make sure it is more involved into the action. Bishop to b2, as we expected. Knight down here to e4. It's a nice little outpost, not really going to hold on to this for too long. Very easy to just play pawn to d3. And then bishop up here to f6 and says, yeah, if you want to exchange, if you want to come up here, take with your bishop, I can just recapture with my knights right here. White decides for another plan, plays pawn to c4 and says, yeah, I'm going to defend my bishop with my queen now, and I'm going to push in the process with my pawns. Black decides to go ahead and take with his bishop down here on b2. I think he does have another option, not the easiest to find right away, and that is to play knight to c3, attacking the queen. If Nakamura wants to go ahead and exchange his bishop here, bishop comes back here, I think this is fine. This gets back to us a spot where both sides are even in material. You don't have to worry about your opponent having bishops, and you have a knight, and then the board opens up, and they have more aggressive pieces. And if for some reason the queen moves, queen to d2 makes a lot of sense, then pawn to d4 is started getting tricky for white to deal with. Removing this pawn right here, you really need a knight or the dark square bishop. Doesn't really have those. Doesn't have another pawn that can come and remove this as well. So this is going to be a great outpost for black here. Really just going to see Nakamura exchange material so he doesn't have to deal with that. But in the game, we see Dominguez, instead of playing knight to c3, which I think is probably the better option, he decides just go ahead and take this bishop here on b2, and then queen takes on b2 as well. So white does have the bishop. Black has the knight, needs to move that knight, comes back here to f6. So very important that black maintains some structure in the center of the board. He wants it to stay closed, does not want to open up this board state. Bishops are going to do much better if all the pawns are off the board, can control the entire board state, where if there's a lot of pawns, you're trying to move around material, knights do better because they can't be blocked off, they can hop over. So that's really what black's going for. Nakamura, on the other hand, looking to exchange all the pawns off the board and really dominate with the only minor piece that can control most of the board, and that is this light square bishop here on f1. Nakamura starts to attack on the queen side, plays queen to a3, attacking the pawn and this rook up here on f8. Main target, though, is the pawn on a7, and we do see black play pawn down to a5. It is protected by the queen on d8, but I really don't like to tie up material, especially your most powerful piece on the board, to defending a pawn. I think it's just as easy to play pawn to a6. This is going to be defended by the pawn. Now the queen can get involved, don't have to worry about it, but decides to push a little further, play pawn to a5. Rook up here to e7 is a great move from Nakamura. You always want to get your rook on your opponent's 7th rank, and since he does have this queen here on a3, does add that protection here that he can really start to attack. This rook is attacking right now this pawn on b7, and so Dominguez plays rook to b8 to protect that. Rook over here to e1, and white has all the attacking going on. Black is really in defense mode right now. King to g8, just getting another defender as close to the action as possible. Pawn to g3, opening up for the light square bishop to come here to the g2 square and really control these light squares in the center of the board. Rook here to e8, and then we start to see some exchange on the board. Rook takes on e8, the knight takes, and then pawn takes, queen comes down here to d5, and then bishop to g2 as we talked about, now forcing the queen to move. Queen comes back here to d8, and then queen c5. So centralizing the queen. It is also attacking this pawn on a5, which it was before, but just continues to improve his position as well as force his opponent to still defend this square over here on a5. Black looking to get his knight involved into the game, plays knight to f6 and then queen to a7. This almost seemed like what Nakamura had been going for, always putting pressure on the pawn on a5, but always getting his pieces in a more aggressive position. The 7th rank is exactly where you want to be. The queen is extremely dangerous because the rook now threatens rook to e7. Black queen can't take this because then the rook here on b8 is going to fall. So really tricky as far as how black continues. He recognizes that there's some back rank mate opportunities for white in the future. So he plays pawn to g6, giving his own king some air so he can come to g7 if it ever needs to in a pinch. And then pawn to d4. Queen down here to d6, trying to centralize the queen. There's not a lot of great squares for the queen to come to, but says, yeah, I'll come down here. I can take this pawn if you were to take my pawn on a5. So he still has the material, equalization right there. Then we see rook to d1, says, okay, I'm going to defend this pawn. Now I can attack your pawn here on a5. Queen comes back here to d8, protecting that pawn. Pawn up here to h3. Now this just negates even more squares that black can go to. Can't bring his knight here to g4. Already couldn't come to e4. So Nakamura doing a good job of cutting off all of the potential options that black has. Black's really just sitting there playing defense right now. King to g7, a rook here to e1. Knight back to d7. The same thing Nakamura's done all game. Anytime black retreats, Nakamura pushes forward. The knight here on f6 was protecting the square on d5. It is no longer, so Nakamura pushes forward with pawn d5. We see an exchange in the center of the board, bishop takes, and now white has done what we talked about you need to do, and that is open up the board state. This knight here on d7 is not adding a lot of value, not putting pressure on white. This light square bishop controls the entire game right now with an open board state. It can get to anywhere very, very quickly, but already attacking two of these pawns right here for black. So black's in a world of trouble, has to defend as best as possible and just hope that Nakamura makes a mistake. Fortunately for black, Nakamura does not make many mistakes, especially in a rapid format. The knight comes back to f6. Seems like the square it always ends up. Bishop comes back to f3. Queen to c7. King up here, g2, just protecting the pawn on h3. Pawn down h5, just pushing forward here, h4. Queen comes back here to d8. And this is an interesting spot because Nakamura, I think, finds the best move, but it's very tempting just to go ahead and take this material here on b7. It almost looks like your opponent doesn't know what's going on, doesn't feel like he has a great move, and so just gives up some material because what else can he do here? But from here, black can just come down, play queen to c7. This is threatening to take material here. He does have both the rook and the queen attacking this b7 square. So yeah, maybe the rook comes up here, queen takes, now the queen takes the other rook, but then the queen comes down here to a3, and black can gobble up material. White's not able to be up in material like he was before. So in this case, white's probably not as good off as if he looks at it and says, yeah, I can just take this pawn. But Nakamura finds the better move, and that is a rook up here to e5. Continues the same threat that he had before of taking on b7, but also opens up the potential for taking material here on a5. Before, it was always the queen attacking and the queen defending, but now the rook is involved, just adding another layer that black has to deal with from the attacking front. So knight comes down here to g7 or g4, excuse me, attacking the rook. Rook comes to d5. It is being protected by the bishop on f3, attacking the queen. Queen comes down here, c7. But now queen takes on a5, as we talked about, has protection from this rook. So that's one pawn. Pawn pushes forward b6, forcing the queen to come back here to d2. Now the queen's eyeing over on the king side of the board. Knight to f6, the same square that Dominguez has brought it to almost every time here. Queen to d4, and this is pinning down the knight. So if we thought the knight wasn't doing much before, it is not going to be moving anywhere anytime soon. Pawn to b5, completely not looking at what's going on, but where does black really go? He's just trying for something, recognizing he has no moves on the king side of the board. And Nakamura here finds a great decoy move, and that's bishop taking on h5. The knight can't take it because it's being pinned down by the queen. The pawn can't take it because rook can come over here to g5. Check. Forcing the king to move here. It's going to come off. This is the only defender of the knight here on f6. So as soon as it moves, then this knight's going to fall here on f6. And white's just up too much material. Can gobble up this pawn here on h5. You know, up 3 pawns, can just start gobbling up even more material and also threaten a back rank mate here, or a mate on the back rank with the rook up here on h8. Just so many threats that black has to deal with. So doesn't go far from here. After the pawn comes down here to b5. We see that decoy move. A bishop takes on h5. Rook to a8. Says, yeah, I'm going to try to take some material here on a2. Bishop comes back to f3. Rook takes on a2, but then rook up to d6. Queen e7. There's just too much threats coming on. And then after pawn to g4, Dominguez recognizes that pawn to g5 is the next move. There's no way to stop that. The knight is going to fall. And at the end of the day, he is forced to resigns. So Nakamura, with the win, jumps into the lead, jumping Fabian Caruana, who drew his last 2 matches. For Nakamura, though, he ends up tying for first in the rapid section with Shakir Mamadirat, who also had a great day 3 as well. So they share the lead of the rapid portion. There's an overall winner as well after the Blitz section. We have 18 rounds of Blitz starting tomorrow. So a lot of room for all these competitors to be the overall champion of the tournament. But Nakamura, congratulations to him for tying first place in the rapid section. Coming out the gate, always getting a loss in the first round is tough, but to battle back in a format that he's extremely good at and win is very encouraging. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the rapid portion. The Blitz portion gets even crazier as they have less time. Just so many wild variations. Going to be fun over the next few days. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.